And Melissa, they're still moving people, so it'll take another minute or two to get people sort of allocated. Thanks.
Yep. Still missing 2 panelists too, so I figured we'd give it a few. It's like there's a little countdown timer where you watch how many participants are joining, and it's like watching popcorn in the microwave, how many seconds between pops so you know when to pull it out before it burns. Come on, we've all done this, yes? Yeah.
Are we the popcorn in that picture?
I'm sorry?
Are we the popcorn in that picture, Melissa?
No, the count on the bottom of how many participants, for sure. For sure.
It's better than getting ready to present your paper and, only the, presenters being there live with you. So, I guess it's better.
Academy in Hawaii was the lowest attendance I've ever seen at sessions I was in. Who can blame people though? All right, should we go ahead and get started, Brett? All right, fantastic. So this is a session on the challenges and opportunities of publishing faith-related research. And we're actually very fortunate to be joined by a panel of individuals who have published in this space in some top journals. We also have a couple of former or current editors at journals such as AMJ, JBV, and SEJ that can hopefully chime in on both the challenges from their perspective of having published in this space, but also in terms of being an editor and any advice on how to help us get our work, should we all be so inspired by today's conference, which I'm sure we are and will continue to be so, to do this work and try to get it published in these top outlets. So I'd like to start by asking each of the panelists to introduce themselves one more time and share kind of the highlights and lowlights of your experiences of publishing in top journals on faith-related research. And we'll go in the order that people are listed in the program to avoid kind of unmuting confusion. So is Elaine Eklund here? Yes, Elaine, why don't you go first? So go ahead, introduce yourself and share with us your highlights and lowlights of publishing faith-related research.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I had a hard time getting in, so I'm literally just this minute joining. Thank you for repeating. So I'm Elaine Howard Ecklund. I'm a professor of sociology at Rice University, where I also hold a chairship in social sciences and am director of the Religion and Public Life program. I would say that in terms of, just to orient the group, I have done extensive work on scientists' attitudes towards religion. And so understanding faith and work in a scientific environment, and to a less extent in medicine as well. And more recently, I have completed a national study with Denise Daniels, who is a professor of entrepreneurship at Wheaton College and couldn't unfortunately join us today. We have done a national survey of over 13,000 US adults, as well as in-depth interviews with 200 and focus groups. And so are publishing that. And that is a broad project about faith in the workplace for Jewish, Christian, and Muslim individuals, as well as those with no faith and the spiritual but not religious. And so that's kind of just to give you an orienting of the kind of work that I'm talking about when I say publishing work related to faith. And I am also a sociologist of religion, so I've thought about this quite deeply. I would say that in my home discipline of sociology, there is an established field of sociology of religion, but it is considered a somewhat minor field in the discipline. And so sociologists would generally like to see social phenomenon as explained in terms of something else that's not religion, if that makes sense. And so there's often this sense that, so the highlight is that we do have an established subfield. And I know for some of you, depending on your discipline, you might not even have an established subfield within your discipline where it's okay to talk about the phenomenon that you study in relationship to religion and to do research and publish in that area. So I would say that's a highlight in some ways. So I've been, president of one of our main associations, which is the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion. I've been a chair of the religion section of the ASA. So there's an established infrastructure, which is positive. The journals that we publish in and so forth are not as highly ranked as some other journals in our discipline. And so there's a real push. This is a low light, and the jobs are not as plentiful. So at my point in career, I find myself often advising students that are my PhD students not to focus on religion as much as they want to, because of the lack of job prospects in my discipline. And to always make sure they have a strong second and sometimes even third area of research that they can publish in. And so strategically, one is always like doing a gazillion things to gain legitimacy in the discipline, if that makes sense. And for me, I'm very, very fortunate to have a tenured position at a major research university, which I don't take for granted, and especially in these times. But my concern is mainly about mentoring junior scholars. I've had a lot of postdoctoral fellows. Actually, 2 of my former postdocs are in this conference, which is really wonderful to see. And both have done it really, really well. But it's just the graduate students and postdocs and even undergrads who want to go to graduate school. So how do you advise them and what makes sense for them in terms of job prospects and so forth? So I'm happy to speak on and on about any of these issues that people attach to, but that's my initial comment.
Great. Thank you. Ali?
Yeah, thanks. And I can second many things that Elaine said. So our disciplines are quite similar, I think. So my guess, one low light would be, I've sent a piece on religion and leadership to Leadership Quarterly, and the editor wrote a 1 sentence back, "We don't publish stuff like this here." I should probably print out that email. And so that was a couple of years ago. I should print out that email and just show it around every time I talk about this. I mean, the piece later got published in Academic Management Perspectives, but I guess, that was 4 or 5 years ago. And that obviously came as a shock to me. I was still, I think, in the end of my PhD, and how do you deal with that, right? And I showed it around to senior colleagues, and they encouraged me and so on to pursue this further. And then a highlight, and Elaine, highlight is in a way in AMJ, and she took part in it because she was our editor, Elaine Hollensbe, on religion and business. And I guess the highlight there is, in terms of faith, is while the process was rigorous and challenging and tricky and many rounds of reviews, the beauty was that religion was never a problem as a distinct or different from, let's say, any other category we could have examined, right? So it was obviously important to, there were questions about whether religion matters and so on, which is good, right? But it wasn't ever the case that, why do you study religion in the first place? And I think that is I think, a kind of an attitude or a perspective I think one needs to work with, right? I mean, these top journals want us to be rigorous and so on, but also a perspective one can work with. And so I guess one recommendation then in that is, obviously we need this community because we need to recommend reviewers, editors, and so on who have that perspective, right? It won't be easy to get into these top journals, but it will be fair in some sense, I guess.
Great commentary. Elaine Hollensbe, you're next.
Well, I just want to say I feel really honored to be listed in the highlight for comments here. As a doctoral student, I was both a consultant and a researcher of the Episcopal Church, and then I moved to the University of Cincinnati and joined a research team, and we continued our work in the church, which has been mostly on identity and work-life balance and emotion. So this wasn't really about entrepreneurship per se, but it was in a religious context, and the topics that we were involved with certainly would apply to entrepreneurs. I've also always been interested in identity work and how people make sense of who they are in organizations. So while I was an AE at AMJ, I worked with Jerry George, who is an entrepreneurship scholar, on an FTE from the editor on organizations with purpose. And we worked in collaboration with a cardinal in the Catholic Church, which was really an intriguing experience on mostly about how businesses should be generators of trust and goodwill, not just profits. And so that was a fun experience that got me kind of into this space. And, you know, I think also a lot of identity work is related to this because certainly religion and faith is a type of identity. So anyway, my experience has been both as an author and as an editor. And I'd say as far as a highlight, it's meaningful work. And, you know, there's nothing better than meaningful work. It's also fun work. I think it's not kind of the drudgery, tread over topics that we constantly are doing in management, but it's something innovative and new. And I would say a low light would be the limited, when I was doing my early work, the limited experience of reviewers with research, both in this context and also I do qualitative research. So it's always kind of this uphill battle of explaining and oriented reviewers before they would be receptive to what the paper was. And I think that we've come a long way in that regard, but I would say that was a low light. Thanks, Melissa.
Thank you. Kent, you're up next.
Good afternoon, everyone. I would have to say that in response to the question that was raised regarding highlights and lowlights, that overwhelmingly my experience has been one of highlights. This has actually proved to be a really productive area of research, and I have been amazed to see the receptivity to the work that I have offered to various journals. All of the papers that I have written that were related to matters of religion and spirituality or methods associated with bringing our faith into our research have actually been published in the first choice journal that I had selected. That is my initial targeted journal, with one exception. The one exception was a paper that just came out in Journal of Management, Spirituality, and Religion on discernment. And that one initially I sent to the Academy of Management Annals, and because of the lack of sufficient prior empirical research, it simply didn't qualify. So it wasn't so much a fault in the manuscript as it was just the state of the literature wasn't quite ready for a review piece that would qualify for Academy of Management Annals. But with that one exception, in all other cases, I think I've reached my target audience. And I even think with regard to the piece on discernment that JMSR is actually a wonderful outlet for that particular piece. So I'm satisfied even in that case. And I also would highlight for the group a letter that I got back for final acceptance for a paper that I published in Organizational Research Methods, which was about how we bring our own spirituality into the research process. And I got a really interesting response from the editor, and the essence of the response was, I completely disagree with the perspective that you're bringing, but I'm open to the conversation. In other words, it gave me a reassurance that even though we're going to be dealing with editors that bring their own perspectives, some of them really bringing perspectives that are more from a normative view of secularism and wanting to make sure that the work is being done from a more secular perspective. Nevertheless, there is a fair-mindedness out there. There is the possibility that people could actually become open to perspectives that are more grounded in a faith perspective that we bring into the research. And so again, I want to present that as being really a series of highlights that I have had in my past publishing experience. A low light in terms of my own failings would be I have wanted for some time to follow up on an invitation that I have from Journal of Management, Spirituality, and Religion to develop a special issue in which we would actually apply some of these methods of reflective believing and interfaith dialogue in the context of doing management and organizational research. But I am not well networked in the sense of knowing others who could serve as co-editors for that kind of a special issue. And so, you know, it's on an occasion like this where we have an audience of people that consists of potentially qualified co-editors that we might be able to put together a very interesting pluralist group of co-editors and begin to think about how we might work on special issues together. And that's a dream that I have, something I'm interested in, but it's something that to date I've simply had to postpone.
Those are all very promising and positive notes, Kent, so thank you very much. Jeff.
Yeah, so I'd say the highs, there's two probably. One is just it's enjoyable to write because you can reflect on so much, right? It's like I've only written one family business paper, but it was just an easy paper to write because there's so many examples, right, that come to mind, and it's just so easy to draw upon that well. And I think that's the same with faith. You know, you can really kind of reflect on your own journey, on the journeys of others that you've seen around you. That I am an abductive reasoning type person that just lives off analogy, and it's amazing how many analogies that faith provides in other work too, in your other research. So a lot of my other research that isn't explicitly faith is faith driven. It's based on a faith foundation, and me trying to deal with faith problems of my own and friends and stuff, and thinking about how that affects entrepreneurial decision making. It's just such an easy bridge to go back and forth, and you don't necessarily have to call it that, but it is that. We deal with faith all the time in entrepreneurial decision making. It's uncertainty is what's more uncertain than religious than what's after life, after this life. There's nothing more uncertain than that. So there's a lot of insight that you can draw from that, and I like that. I think that's a highlight. The other highlight is people, the people that I've worked with in this space. There's just a connection there because they're asking these questions. So it's not necessarily, I wouldn't say it's necessarily the Holy Spirit, you know, I mean, some people would say that, but I think it transcends faith. It's people that are interested in asking questions like, why are we here? They're on a journey of kind of understanding what's this life for. And I think science draws that from a lot of people, but there are some that lean way more towards the material end, and some that lean far much more towards the spiritual end, and we see more of them drawn to this field and these questions, and I guess I just fall on that end. So there's a little bit more of the metaphorical, the theoretical, and I enjoy working with and talking to those people. So that's a benefit. In terms of the low light, in our previous session, Ted Baker asked about a Christian bias and worried about a Christian bias. And I get the worry. I understand that because of the sampling of the conference and stuff. It's the wrong bias, though. The actual bias that he should be worried about, from what I've seen with the journals, is institutional bias. That how is religion necessary when we have informal institutions? And that question almost single-handedly devastates a lot of the religious papers that I see come in. The reviewers ask that question. So it's two things. It's that question of why do we need this over and above that, when that's such an encompassing framework? And it's a good question. It's a fair question. It's a good scientific question to ask. Why do we need another construct? Why do we need another lens over and above that? So that's fair in that regard. The other one is just an absolute dismissal of, there's just a lack of interest because it's not in the reviewer's wheelhouse. Faith is not a part of their life. Religion is not a part of their life. They're just not interested. So it's not they're anti. They don't find it interesting. It'd be like me picking up a paper and I don't know. I was going to pick on a field, but I don't know. Let's just I'm a former accountant, so I can bash my own area. You know, picking up something in accounting, you know, I'd be like, okay, there's not enough coffee in the world, and I get that, right? So it could just be that, right? It's not that they're necessarily, I don't want to see faith in the journal. It's just not interesting to them. It's not, and we don't have necessarily the reviewer pool yet. It's developing because you have to know who those people are that will be responsive to this. Not necessarily because they just want to see faith stuff published, but they'll just be open-minded enough to give it a fair review and hold it to the same standards. And that just takes time for any new area. So that's probably a low light, is that we're probably at that area. We're at that stage where at JBV, now that might be different. Journals that are already open to this have already gone down that path. But at the moment, that's kind of where it is in the cultivation of the review process and stuff. So that would probably be my answer.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. Peter.
Yeah, just to piggyback on what Jeff said, I know that, from SEJ's perspective, I don't think there's any particular preference for or against papers that deal with faith or other aspects of religion, ex ante. There are the practical issues, as Jeff mentioned, lack of a deep reviewer pool, and we don't currently have any AEs who specialize in particular on religion and spirituality. but I mean, not many journals in business administration do. You know, on the positive side, you know, at the 2 breakout sessions that I've participated in this morning, plus listening to Jeff's excellent keynote, you know, I've jotted notes on, I don't know, a dozen potential research questions that I think are super interesting and important, that are at the intersection of entrepreneurship, faith, spirituality, religion, et cetera, on which there isn't a whole lot of existing literature, and, you know, for which I think our community would be extremely receptive. Note that, you know, there are studies not only in which faith is the explanatory variable. You know, what is the impact of the individual's faith orientation on entrepreneurial decision making? Another topic would be how sort of shared spirituality or common religious beliefs would help entrepreneurs to overcome, you know, deep uncertainty in engaging and enrolling stakeholders, both internal and external stakeholders. There are also studies in which religion and spirituality would be the thing to be explained. There's some interesting discussion in the last breakout about, you know, the emergence of new religious groups, new religious sects, church planting. You know, we have a huge literature, both theoretical and empirical, on spin-outs, you know, spin-offs and spin-outs. It seems to me, it would be extremely interesting to use some of that framing, use those theories, try to understand those mechanisms as they would apply to the creation of new religious groups, and how that might be different from the creation of other kinds of nonprofits, and of course from commercial ventures as well. You know, one piece of advice, I guess, is that I think, as with any, you know, kind of either novel construct or novel application, and Jeff touched on this as well, you know, the burden is always on the author to demonstrate the value added, right? Not just to those who already have a very deep interest in this particular phenomenon or mechanism or research question, but why would this be of interest to entrepreneurship scholars or management scholars or social scientists more generally? And I think, you know, framing the research question in terms of what we already know, right? Here's a body of literature that can be applied also to the religious context or to religious organizations. Or, you know, I'm looking at a conventional phenomenon, I'm using faith and spirituality as a means of explaining that phenomenon. What does that do for us that our existing constructs and approaches and so forth don't do? I think as long as we can frame these research questions and the answers that we provide so that they're, you know, that the value added relative to the existing literature is clear, I don't see any reason why reviewers and editors you know, would be hostile to that kind of research. On the contrary, I think there's a lot of potential to add a new dimension and to maybe provide some insight on some phenomena beyond what we already know. But I look forward to questions that people have, and also reports of experiences that some of you may have had, both good or bad, in trying to publish research in this area.
That's a great segue, Peter. Thank you. I want to pose a very specific question, and that is, you know, Jeff brought up this morning the difference between faith, spirituality, and religion. Those of you that have published in this space on the panel, can you speak a little bit to the extent to which you've had to define those distinctions, or have chosen one versus the other, or how you've sort of grappled with what do you mean in your work by faith, religion, or spirituality, in case there are lessons learned there that can help the rest of us? And anybody on the panel that wants to chime in, please do so.
Sure, I'll start, Melissa, if that's okay. So I'm coming at this very specifically as a sociologist, so my disciplinary difference might be relevant here from some others. So we often are looking at how people define things in their own terms. And so we would ask our respondents about the content of those terms for them, if that makes sense. That gets a little bit harder when you turn to doing more quantitative work, where the researcher needs to define for herself the content of the terms to ask questions about them. And there are actually pretty good existing measures of religion, faith, and spirituality in sociology of religion literature, and I think in psychology of religion literature as well, and in other literatures, organizational behavior and so forth. But that is a constant discussion in sociology. And I think you define those terms differently based on what you're using them for and what kinds of groups you're studying. And so that's something that I think about, and telling reviewers, why I'm using the terms that I am is really, really important. You may have been asking something a little bit different about the faith of the researcher and how that informs work. I don't know if you're asking about that, but that's a different kind of conversation, I think.
Yeah, I think the question was more related to in your writing, how do you sort of disentangle that or choose what you're looking at? But I absolutely think your second point is a great one, where what you bring to the table certainly as an individual affects the work that you do. So why don't we'll throw that out to both questions then to the panel, like how do you address that potential bias for your own spirituality, faith, or religion influencing sort of the lens through which you do that work?
I really want to speak to the second issue, but let me speak to the first, and then maybe we'll get back to the second part. The first part here is that in my own experience, the field does not take kindly to the imposition of a definition. And it hasn't been with regard to the terms that we're talking about right now, but previously, trying to define certain terms. And in some sense, that's viewed by reviewers and by editors as being an imposition. I think that's a problem. I agree with Elaine's perspective to say that there are various ways in which we could define each of these terms, and we can select the way that seems most appropriate to the particulars of the research that we're trying to accomplish. I think that's fine. I think we define them internally within the context of our own work, and we use them consistently within that context. I think as academicians, we tend to think about definitions at the field level emerging through this broad conversation that has to take place. And if it's not an emergent definition, if it seems more like an imposition, then that becomes problematic. But if it's simply my affirming, this is my understanding and my use of these terms in the context of this particular research project or program of research, I don't see any problem with that whatsoever. And you shouldn't bump up against the same level of resistance as you would if you were trying to speak to the definition that ought to hold universally.
Elaine Hollensbe, go ahead.
Thanks, Melissa. Yeah, I think there's a challenge in that definitions are inherently specific and they're, precise. And we're talking about some things that are less perhaps specific and precise. And so I think we're used to looking at objective things like constructs that are easily definable, where this is more subjective or intersubjective, which makes it challenging. I was working with Matthew Sheep on a project, on his second year project. He was a former doctoral student of mine and also now a colleague. And he did a second year project on spirituality, and the title of it was Pinning Down Gossamer, which I thought was a perfect title. You're trying to make something precise that's relatively imprecise. As far as potential bias, I think that's also a good question. I know as a qualitative researcher, I was taught to bracket my own subjectivity to the extent I could. I'm not an Episcopalian. I was studying Episcopalians, and they were actually making assessments of my own faith as I was doing the research. And so my field notes were really fun to read post hoc because I had all this venting in the brackets of, how I felt about what was going on. So yeah, I think the idea of objectivity is a little bit counter to what we're talking about. So anyway, just wanted to weigh in. Thanks.
Elaine and Kent, I know you had other Elaine and Kent. Brett, why did you put two Elaines on the panel? That's really confusing. You wanted to comment on that second question as well, of keeping your own sort of self out of the work that you're doing, or to what extent you can or do.
So it's interesting to have other Elaine here making really phenomenal points related to qualitative or more interpretive research. I think sometimes there's a fallacy in my own discipline in the social sciences that qualitative work is the more subjective, and that quantitative work is inherently objective. And I do think there is a sense of subjectivity in quantitative work as well. So I, of course, as the researcher, am defining all concepts that I put on surveys, just because I have large N scale studies and there's validity involved and all. So there's all those kinds of issues I could speak to about epistemology later if folks are interested. But so there's also conventions within disciplines that are really different. So more recently, in both anthropology especially, but in sociology to a lesser extent, researchers have been encouraged in qualitative studies to sort of come clean about their own identities and how they think their identities as researchers may have an impact on the research that they're doing. And so I think that's something to think through. For me, I've been part of Protestant Christian churches for most of my life. I think that having that particular faith background and perspective has at times helped me get access to certain kinds of communities, and certainly helped me have a great understanding of certain kinds of communities, but it at other times has been a detriment, right? Has made me very much an outsider to certain communities. So that kind of Elaine just put in the chat, that kind of self-reflexivity. So I wouldn't want us to say that only people without religion lack bias and people with religion have bias or lack bias. Like, I don't think these things, there's a neat break there, that all of us have bias and there's a way in which we can reflect on it that's actually, I think, helpful to the research process. So I love to talk about this, as you can tell. So I'll stop there and so others can speak.
Great.
I would just ask people to think about the question, what is it that brought you to this conference today? What is it that brings you to the topic of religion, spirituality, faith, and its relationship to entrepreneurship? And without taking a poll, but just based on some of the comments I've already heard from other people in the prior sessions today, I think there's a lot of who we are as people that we're bringing to this discussion. The reason that we're drawn to this topic is not necessarily because it's the low-hanging fruit in terms of publishing opportunities. In fact, we're seeing it as a challenging domain, and yet there's something of ourselves that is really at stake in doing this kind of research. There's some dimension of being expressive or even of practicing our own faith perspectives within the context of doing research on this topic. And to the extent that that's true, I have written several papers that are oriented towards methods that we would use as we bring ourselves. And so if we the perspective that I'm going to take is that all research is involving the researcher as an interpreter, and the interpreter necessarily brings some perspective to the research. It's not a posture of objectivity. And in light of that, I believe that there's a basis for challenging norms of secularism within our research. That is, to the extent that the community of researchers say that we need to bracket our own faith perspective in order to do credible research to contribute to the field, I would push back on that by saying that, in fact, I think we have a broad recognition that that work is interpretive. And if we look at the discussions of philosophy of science, I think we are post-positivism and in many respects postmodern in terms of how we think about philosophy of science, in which case the notion of objectivity really is something of an artifact from the past, but instead we recognize that we always bring perspective. But in light of bringing perspective and in light of recognizing that I'm always situated in the perspective that I bring, that offers a different kind of an opportunity. And the opportunity is one that I've referred to as reflective believing. That is, we bring ourselves, and in doing so, I think, what I've heard from other conference participants is that we're bringing some integrity to this process by bringing our whole selves into the research process. But as we bring ourselves into this research, how can we also be reflective in the way in which we're bringing ourselves? And so our engagement certainly is with a phenomenon. We're engaging the phenomenon of entrepreneurship, but as we engage the phenomenon of entrepreneurship, we are bringing to that phenomenon a body of literature that speaks to that phenomenon. And we are also bringing of faith tradition. And how is it that instead of just having a dialogue between the literature and the phenomenon, now we have a three-way dialogue, which is the dialogue of who I am as a person of faith coming into this research topic and engaging the literature and engaging the phenomenon from that perspective. So I think there's a potential here for a richer dialogue to take place. And the other piece of this is that all of these faith perspectives, to my knowledge, bring some notion of human flourishing. What does it mean to really prosper in this context? And others have spoken to the issue that it's not simply material prosperity, but there are other dimensions of what it means to flourish in this context. So I bring that into the phenomenon of entrepreneurship in dialogue together with the literature. And as I'm able to reflect on that perspective, I am both shaping the interpretation, but my faith understanding is also shaped in that dialogical process. And so that's, that's what I would like to bring into this conversation in terms of methodologically. What this may open up for us is the possibility that we actually bring our whole selves to the research process, that we begin to see some fulfillment of the desires that we have, which revolve around the practice of faith and doing that as researchers, and that we could bring that into conversation with one another in a form that would take place through interfaith dialogue, that we would not simply just be dialoguing with ourselves or from within our own faith perspective, but instead we would have a set of other participants within that dialogue, so that each of us are bringing a unique perspective, and we recognize the interpretive perspectives, and we're explicit and reflective about those perspectives, but we're also doing that in the context of dialogue with others.
I love this idea of bringing our full selves and our whole selves into our research, and in a way that we can flourish as humans. There's a lot of great conversation going on in the chat as well. And I just want to highlight something that Sarah said, which is she likes to partner with someone in her research from a different faith background. And so that you're getting a multiplicity of perspectives that are still integrating faith, but they are, or lack of faith, frankly, but you're not providing that kind of dominant view that we were talking about earlier of kind of tending towards one faith perspective, or a sort of closely mirrored faith perspective, but pairing with someone that has very, very different faith perspectives, such as yourself. And so I think that's a fascinating idea as well. I also heard, just in response to these kind of paired together questions, the idea that we have to be very careful to define what it is we're talking about, whether we're using one of the multiplicity of definitions that are out there, as Elaine Ecklund said, in terms of, the sociology of religion has a lot of great definitions and scales to measure faith, spirituality, religion. We can choose to use those, or we can choose to use something different, but we need to be super clear in our writing, just as with any other construct we might be studying. What exactly are we talking about? Why is it valuable? And what is it bringing to the table that tells us something new that we didn't know already? We have just about 7 minutes left. And so I just wanted to pose kind of one more big question to the panelists, which is, what is your best advice, other than what we've already heard, based on the challenges you have faced in getting this research published? And we have 57 people online today that presumably are here because they would like to publish in the space if they're not already. What's your advice? What should they do specifically to help them get published in the best journals in their respective fields? And the first, Elaine, to your point, we do have folks here from an entrepreneurship background for sure, but we also have some folks that are not in the entrepreneurship community. Who wants to tackle that one first?
A suggestion. I think it's this. I think this would be an area that'd be very easy to be self-defeating by assuming a bias. And I think that actually is disservice to anybody doing research in the area. I think they should walk into the area assuming that they are going to get an open hearing, that people are going to want to see this work if done well, and take it upon themselves as authors. And I say this to myself as well, when I'm doing a new area, when I'm moving into a new area, that it's on me. I have to do good research. I have to prove that this is worthy to be read. I have to tie into conversations and tell the reader why it is that they should want to read this and how it changes their research, and make it relevant to them. And if I go in there thinking that people just don't want it because they're anti-religion, I'm going to get frustrated. I'm going to get angry. I'm going to lose my motivation. I'm going to blame the system. And that is just, I think there are enough people, from what I'm seeing today, that you can get a fair shake, and you're going to get an unfair shake sometimes, but that's true with non-faith research too, right? All the time we get a random reviewer who just hates all things that you've just done. So, so I think that would be my piece of advice, because I think it's very easy in this, especially in this, something so personal as this, to extrapolate and feel defeated by the process when it's, and just read more into the tea leaves than are actually there.
I can jump in if that's, are you done, Jeff? Okay.
Yep.
I'd say in some ways the advice I'd give somebody wouldn't be different from what I'd give them for some other kind of research that they were doing. You want to tell a compelling story and a convincing story. And I think, you know, there's a tendency in some ways when we, particularly when we work with qualitative research in a kind of a amorphous or, you know, open area like spirituality, that we tend to lean toward description. And I know of the papers that I edited at AMJ, probably the number one thing that got papers rejected was that they weren't analytic. They were totally descriptive. And so I would encourage a friendly review from somebody who's not a spirituality researcher, so that they can see things that you might not see because you're so close to the topic. I'd also, you know, encourage looking at a piece of work that's done well and deconstructing it so that you can understand how somebody's gotten around the hurdles. There's always going to be a hurdle, I think, particularly if you're studying a site. So we were studying the Episcopal Church, which is a very unusual site. And, you know, you get reviewers who think that's artifactual or that's, you know, site specific. So to the extent you can explain how what you're finding is transferable across multiple settings. And you do that by avoiding getting artifactual and descriptive and being more analytic and theoretical. So tell a convincing story, try to make sure you point to the significance and importance of it beyond the artifact or the site where you're actually doing it, and getting a friendly review, I think would be things I'd suggest.
Great suggestions.
I'll jump in if that's okay, Melissa. I have published both peer-reviewed journal articles and books, and so I have maybe some different advice for both. I do think it's important in terms of journals to try to think about the top journals in whatever your discipline is, and to try to understand the conversations, the scholarly conversations that are going on in those journals. And it's, for this whole subfield, I do think it's super useful for us to get into those journals just strategically. And so to start there with that being a kind of goal, if possible, and to try to help them understand how research on religion and entrepreneurship relates to the specific conversations going on in those journals. And then I also think subfield journals are fantastic as well. And so I don't want to in any way appear to be disparaging. So in my subfields, like Sociology of Religion, Journal for the Scientific Study of Religion, those are journals, but Social Forces and American Sociological Review are much more highly ranked than the subfield journals. And so I try really hard to get our stuff into those journals and as well as the subfield journals. And then the other thing is thinking about both quality, but also volume of publication. And so trying to hit some kind of sweet spot there. I do think in my own subfield in Sociology of Religion, to get a job, that students I work with, I do think have to publish more than in subfields where they are, where the more common subfields where there's more jobs. And so I do really encourage volume in addition to quality. And I know not everyone agrees with me on that, but that's kind of an approach that's worked for us and our team. And then I think thinking through, things like networks become extremely important in publishing. And I think someone else mentioned that, but getting out to conferences, both subfield conferences like this, which are extremely important for strategizing and encouragement and robust conversation. I've had such a good time here today. But then also whatever the major conferences are in your discipline, making sure you get to those conferences and that you not only just go, but that you actually meet with leaders in the field and talk to them about your work. I've been shocked. I don't think it necessarily should be this way, but I've been shocked at what a positive impact that can have, that kind of networking has on one's ability to publish, especially when it comes to books, where there is a lot of networking in terms of getting into presses and figuring out who people know and reviewing books and blurbing books. I think there's certainly it's this in journal publishing as well, but I think it's especially so with book publishing. And I can speak to more on that if anyone's interested, but those are some initial thoughts I have.
Great. So I was just informed our session goes all the way till 1:15. It doesn't end at 1, so we have a few more minutes. We have a question from Roy, and then I want to get back to a question that came up in the chat about how this impacts your teaching. So let's start with Roy.
Hi, thanks, Melissa. And I just want to build on the prior comments, and I agree entirely with the strategies that have been suggested about how to take, and this is a common problem, how to take what is previously a marginalized topic and get it into mainstream conversations. I can recall, and my answer is going to be yes, do all of those things, but let's not be passive about it. It's not just on me as an author, it's on us as a group here. There's a degree of institutional work that is required to get this into the mainstream. And I recall the similar problem being had by the Identity Group, where they had a difficult time getting their work published. They organized a strategic conference where they agreed on specific constructs and definitions of constructs. And then they took it to a further element of institutional work, and that is you organize streams in prominent international conferences like EGOS and the Academy of Management. You use the attendance at those conferences to persuade leading management journals, say, look, we have this audience, we have this reviewer base, can we do a special issue? You do a special issue, and suddenly the conversation starts switching to a topic that you want. But in this process, you can't be passive about it. I think you have to take the institutional levers that are available to you and move it forward. And this workshop is a fascinating and an outstanding starting point to get that process going.
Great ideas, Roy. Thank you. So let's throw out the question about teaching. I know this is about publishing our work, but to what extent does this, your perspective on spirituality, religion, or faith bleed into your teaching, and should it, and how should it?
Happy to respond to that. I've done a lot of exec ed on entrepreneurship and faith, especially in the Middle East. And oftentimes, like, students knew more about entrepreneurship than I did. They knew more about their faith than I did, but they've never connected the dots, right? So, I mean, and they were fascinating and surprised that they were able to do so. And so I think this is, there is ignorance in this combination in the practitioner world. And so when we teach these things, obviously with humbleness, and it's a tricky topic to teach, right? Like without imposing our own views and values and so on. But what I've seen is when I taught this to students is that they were fascinating and had a chance to reflect and also obtain a language of framing and phrasing of what they were actually practicing and what they wanted to do, up to the point that I had one student, for instance, she wanted to go in the hotel business. She was very religious. She didn't want to serve certain products and so on. And when she heard about this idea of a faith entrepreneurial venturing, she was really like looking forward to this. So another example, I mean, I had princes and princesses from Saudi Arabia. And when you teach them entrepreneurship, they look at you like, you mean I can make some money? That's ridiculous. I'm a multi-millionaire. Who cares about making more money? When you tell them then maybe that your faith perspective has a view on entrepreneurship, then it's something which cannot be maximized, cannot ever be obtained fully. And it's a completely different way of capturing their attention and their ideas and interest in this topic.
Fascinating. Other comments on this from the panel or anybody in attendance? Getting towards the end of the day, we're wearing down. Please go ahead.
Sorry. I would say there's, I would think about the content of what we teach. And I do think students are often hungry for discussions of religion. I've actually been shocked at it sometimes. So I think my colleagues sometimes look askance at what I study, but the students are really amenable to upfront discussions about religion, especially religion in relationship to business and work. And in our case here, entrepreneurship, I've not taught on that, but I would imagine that would be the case as well. In terms of reflecting on our own faiths and or lack of faith, or however, I know people on this call are coming from a variety of different perspectives, and whether one should be transparent about that in the classroom, that's a big discussion. I've kind of gone full circle on that. So I would say earlier in my career, I've been a professor for 15 years, that I thought like you should be totally transparent, and then I went to, perhaps I aged out of that or something. I started to really recognize that I have a lot of the power relationship between me as a professor and a student is quite steep in my favor, actually, and quite strongly. And so I thought, gosh, when I state my perspective on things, then that can inadvertently marginalize others. And so I thought a lot about that for about 5 or 6 years. and then more recently, I've come back. I think I've been doing a lot of smaller classes where I've tried to foster an environment where everyone is sharing personally about how they relate to the subject matter all the time. So I've been trying to think of it like as kind of a collaborative learning environment, and people are in different types of classrooms. And so I think that's different. So I say like, oh, this is how this has come up in my life and how it attaches to what I think as a person and as a person broadly and as a scholar specifically. But I encourage you to think about that as well. And people jump in at different levels. I mean, I think we shouldn't mandate that students share their own faith perspectives for sure, but provide an openness where it would be okay to do so in relationship to the subject matter if they felt like they could, or okay not to. So I'm trying to think about creating that kind of space in a classroom.
In some ways, these are similar questions to what we were dealing with earlier, which is to what extent does an entrepreneur integrate their faith with their business very vocally or explicitly versus implicitly? It's the same struggle we have as scholars, to Kent's earlier points about bringing your whole self to your research or bringing your whole self to your classroom. Jeff, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to add that I've wrestled with this too, because I felt like I've gone both extremes. And what I've found over time, it just makes me the most comfortable is just not to censor myself in bringing my examples. So, if the example comes from church or the example comes from that, I do that. But I don't want to also be falsely overt where you're laying it on too thick, because then it feels, it's just not authentic, right? So, I mean, I think that's the healthy balance that I've reached, is just don't edit it out. So when those ideas come to mind, or that example comes to mind, if that's, Paul and on the road to Damascus, and that comes to mind as an entrepreneurial example or whatever, I'll use it. But then just don't falsify it, I don't know. I don't want to get into selling or proselytizing. And what I find is that's an open invitation. Then if you do it just naturally, if people want to know more, they'll come to you and they'll talk to you more, and we can talk about that offline. But it's still a class on entrepreneurship. It's not a class on theology. So we have to remember what we are getting paid to do. And I want to bring all myself, but that's my choice, and I don't necessarily have the right to hijack the entire room and tell them this is what you need to listen to for the next 10 minutes. So there's a balance there. We have to be respectful, right? Not everybody thinks this is as important as we do.
And as somebody said earlier, it's about making sure people understand what we're trying to communicate, not trying to force a faith perspective. Peter?
Yeah, I agree completely with Jeff. At the same time, many faculty who are quite cognizant of their position in the classroom and therefore reluctant to talk about things like personal beliefs in this dimension have no hesitation whatsoever to bring their political views, other social and cultural ideas into the classroom. I think that the instructor's religious beliefs or perspective on spirituality should be given, should be treated no better or worse than the instructor's personal views on anything else. If it helps to bring an example to life, if it is relevant to illustrating the subject at hand, I don't think we should be especially hesitant on that front. At the same time, obviously, as has been said before, proselytizing in the classroom is not appropriate, but not only on religion, also on a host of other topics for which many faculty seem to have little hesitation to proselytize.
Excellent point. Other comments on this one? Other questions from the individuals in attendance? I know lots have been going into the chat. Anything you want to unmute and ask here? Or comment on, exactly.
I just have a question for Elaine. Elaine, you've done a lot of work on scientists and how they're viewed as religious. So I just wonder if you might share just a moment of that with us about both sides of that, how that works positively and some of the challenges with that.
You mean, Brett, how it's affected me personally as a scholar?
No, but how in terms of your research you've understood that relationship between scientists and religion broadly?
Yeah, so my work previous to the project that I'm commenting on today has been about scientists' attitudes towards religion, and I've done large-scale surveys in 8 different national contexts, and written a couple books about that project, and then have done also work on religious people's attitudes towards science. And so that, I would say that was not viewed as a sociological topic by most. And I have worked really hard with actually a colleague at UCSD, John Evans, to start a subfield for the sociological study of religion and science, to try to really bring data, social science data, there are other kinds of data that have been present, but social science data to some of the current debates that we're seeing around us. And so so I'm I'm starting a subfield there, and that's been kind of hard. But we're both tenured faculty. We've published a fair amount in the space, and we've tried really hard to publish in journals that are legitimate in our field and in top journals and things like that, and to have convenings of junior scholars and get them interested in the topic, and teach them how to attach it to other topics. And I think in regards to faith in the classroom and thinking about religion topics broadly, that this comes up a lot in the science community. And that's something that scientists have talked to me about. I don't want to take too much time on that, but I'm happy to talk offline with folks about that if you're interested in that research.
Any final thoughts or comments or questions from anybody?
I have one final thought, and that's, I don't know if it's a question, probably don't have time for it, but in my mind, there's a difference between research and faith and entrepreneurship that takes existing models and incrementally grows them and says, here's another variable that we should consider to explain whatever we're doing. And research that says, from a faith or spiritual perspective, we're critiquing entrepreneurship. It's not all about making money, or it's not all about this. It's about compassion, and it's about taking care of the environment and taking care of each other. And that's coming out of our faith or holistic perspective. It's a bit like Ron Purser was talking about mindfulness research. Are we using mindfulness to make a stressful workplace less stressful, or are we using mindfulness to have a new way of thinking about things and a new way of thinking about how we do business? And I'm guessing the former is easier to publish than the latter, but that's sort of maybe we don't have time for that, but that was my question or my comment.
Any of our panelists want to chime in on that briefly? Kent, go ahead.
Related to Bruno's comment, I encouraged others earlier to follow their passions, to bring their whole selves to their research. And I've published several articles about methods that we can use to accomplish that. And so I want to continue that encouragement. Nevertheless, following your passion doesn't change the criteria that apply to the editorial decisions that are made by our journals. And so again, in the research that you do, to continue to be phenomenon focused, to continue to engage the empirical phenomenon that's relevant to our field, and to always hold yourself accountable for advancing theory in some way. I think those are critical in terms of editorial decisions. So follow your passion, yes, and read the editorial statements of the journals before you design the research. That would be my final advice.
And what better final advice than follow your passions? For those of you that don't know, that's a big area of my own research, is passion of entrepreneurs. So I want to thank all of the panelists today. I thought this conversation was fascinating. I hope everybody is inspired with the hope that you can indeed publish in these topics in our top journals. You've got a great group of individuals here at this conference today to connect with to help you do that from different faith perspectives. And so thank you to our panelists, and I look forward to seeing you all at our closing keynote in a few minutes.
Yeah, thanks so much, Melissa. We will go ahead and head to a final break here, and then Roy will begin at 1:30. So we've got a little bit of time. If you close out of the breakout room, you go out to the main session, and that's where we'll do the final keynote. Thanks again, Melissa.